It's now, I think, more than a year ago that we posted our first videos on this channel. And this was initially because Fai, a producer, suggested I read The Moral Landscape by Sam Harris. And then we posted this video and we got a lot of responses, but we never really got to respond to the responses. So much belated, we're going to do this today. By far the most criticisms by viewers were about a supposed paradox, namely that they said by criticizing morality, by somehow indicating that morality is bad, I was making a moral judgment and thereby contradicting myself. One typical comment here by Nathan Paulson: if you don't believe in morality, then why are social conflict and violence and all the things you criticize moral discourses for a problem? So, once more, let me explain this. I basically agree with Sam Harris that the quest for well-being, both individually and collectively, is an important quest that both the sciences and philosophy can dedicate themselves to. However, I disagree with Sam Harris that this quest is best being described as moral, just as I think it's not best being described as religious. It's simply a quest for well-being. Now, violence also can be understood as not primarily immoral or sinful, but as not increasing well-being. For instance, obviously violence often causes bodily pain, it causes mental stress, and it causes social dysfunctionality. The basic idea is, just as we can drop the religious framing of, for instance, violence or anything else that doesn't increase well-being, we can also drop the moral framing of it. Violence is neither against God nor actually against moral principles, but in most cases it does not increase well-being. Just to give you an example of an amoral conception of goodness. For instance, if a doctor says smoking 20 cigarettes a day is doing violence to yourself and decreases your well-being, therefore you'd be better off if you would smoke less or stop smoking altogether. If the doctor makes such a statement, she actually neither makes a moral nor a religious statement. And just in the same way, I think we can philosophically emphasize well-being or de-emphasize violence without being moralistic or religious. Nevertheless, people still seem to have, if not a strong religious faith, some form of moral faith. And that seems to be difficult to overcome for viewers like Nathan Paulson, who just cannot see how a defense of amorality isn't moral at the same time. And apparently Sam Harris has exactly the same problem. They just cannot see how a statement against violence is not at the same time also a moral statement. So this shows how powerful still the use of moral language is. I think just as people who grow up in a highly religious environment find it very difficult to understand anything without relating it to God, we, growing up in a heavily moralistic environment, find it difficult to understand anything, or a lot of things at least, without seeing them in a moral register. I like the following comment by Zachary Hershberger, which I think describes the form of relief you can experience once you somehow free yourself from overly religious or overly moralistic frameworks. I'd like to quote Zachary here. "It's the specific contradiction that drove me out of religion. God and morality were too fixed and immediate. Nothing I did mattered or could even matter. I was so young it produced a traumatic impression, but I've learned a lot in overcoming it. Reading philosophy was instrumental in bringing me to a healthy mental state and eradicating the eternal no, as Nietzsche called it. So again, I think he describes wonderfully here what happens when we no longer see everything and judge everything, or at least a lot of things, in terms of their religious or moral value or meaning. And how in this way we somehow overcome moral faith. And I think that we've actually existing amorally in a lot of social contexts. For instance, we no longer apply religion or moral faith in, I already referred to this example, in medicine, right? We no longer see people who are sick either as being punished by God or as somehow morally responsible for their sickness. Similarly, and I gave this example in the first video on Harris, in education, we also no longer treat bad students as bad people. In the economy too, we, at least more often than not, I hope, also do not view poor people as morally bad. And at least hopefully in politics too, we are capable of seeing the political opponents not as morally bad, but just as maybe politically bad. Unfortunately, of course, a lot of problems arise when, for instance, in politics, we switch to a moral coding of political differences. Even in law, I think there is a tendency to move away from moral coding, from moral language, from moral framing. And I mentioned the case of divorce law, where we also no longer try to find out which of the two partners is guilty with regard to the breakdown of the relationship. So thereby, I'd like to contradict one viewer, Andrew Knopp, who writes, "And this fact, I believe, is that morality and moralizing is an essential function of human nature." I don't agree. It is still very common for humans to moralize, and everyone does it, including myself. But I doubt that it is an essential function of human nature and that it is essential also for social functioning. Some viewers also shared their own amoral preferences, and I'd like to quote one here. Mac W. writes, "There are a lot of normative claims that I would consider to be amoral, like the Beatles are better than the Rolling Stones. I think it depends on whether or not the claim is making value judgments that are connected to principles about what behaviors or practices, policies are right and wrong. Someone who says the Beatles are better than the Rolling Stones is implying that they believe the Beatles' music has more value in some way, but they're not implying that you would be doing something wrong or harmful or unsacred by enjoying the Rolling Stones more." Yes, I couldn't agree more. And I think we can extend this very statement to other areas that I just talked about, such as medicine, law, politics, education, and so forth. Not beating children is educationally better than beating children. I think this can probably be empirically proven. But this does not entail the claim that this is so because beating others is a sin or a violation of a specific moral principle. So this brings us to another question by Mark Lebay. Mark writes, "If there is a science of health, why can't there also be a science of morality?" I think that is the chief question to address, specifically with respect to Sam Harris. I agree, that's an important question to address, and I think it can be answered rather simply. Well, medicine, for instance, exists because bodies exist and the mind exists, and therefore we also have something like mental health. Social sciences, for instance, exist, like whatever, economics, political science, law studies, because actually society exists, right? There is an economy, there's politics, there's law. Natural science exists because nature exists, right? Chemistry exists because chemical elements and so forth exist. Then history, sociology, psychology of religion exists because religion also exists. But, and this is the important point, theology is not really a science in this way, because actually, I'm pretty sure God does not exist. And similarly, very similarly, I think also moral science does not exist, because moral principles, unlike principles in physics, for instance, do not really exist. So I think there can very well be something like a history, a sociology, a psychology of morality. And this can be somehow a science of morality, just as we can have a historical science of religion. But we cannot have, in the true sense of the word, a moral science, just as we cannot have a science of God, which traditionally was called theology. Now, another problem was brought up by John Martin, writes, "The professor's conception of morality as a whole seems woefully negative. One is left wondering whether anybody has ever actually been kind to him." Well, first, thanks for addressing me politely as the professor. And then secondly, of course, kindness, empathy, sympathy are very important in human life for everyone, including myself. And they very much increase well-being of people, including my own well-being. But again, I do not think that there is a direct correlation between being kind and being, so to speak, moral. That's not the same thing, right? Just as you can be kind because you are somehow having a moral faith, the same moral faith can also make you very unkind, right? You can very much feel entitled to what is often called righteous anger. So believing in morality and adopting moral language and thinking in moral terms, I don't think empirically increases directly a person's kindness. Just as I don't think that believe in God makes people immediately or makes people more kind than those who do not believe in God. I do not think that there is a direct correlation. This is directly related to a core statement which was made by Roach Dog Jr., who writes, "Just like Zizek said, if there's a God, then everything is permitted. Same with morality. If you believe you're morally justified, you'll do anything. Let's demoralize our reasoning." Again, I couldn't agree more with this statement. And we'll go back to that in a minute. Now, one thing about how to interpret Sam Harris. Jace Rockman says, "That has always been my understanding of Sam's views on morality. I think the comparison he makes between health and morality makes this clear. It's one of his go-to analogies for how he thinks we should be thinking about and talking about morality. Namely, there doesn't need to be an absolute standard of what is healthy good for us to make objective investigations into what makes us healthier, better people." So Jace Rockman basically says that Sam Harris says more or less the same thing that I have been saying. However, I think Matthijssen here corrects this view about Sam Harris. I do not think that Jace Rockman's representation of Harris's idea is correct. So Matthijssen says, in the first step, he, Sam Harris, argues that human flourishing is universally preferred over human misery. This is the point of his world of misery thought experiment. But, and this is important, in the second step, he argues that because this is so, human flourishing is morally good. Not good relative to certain criteria, but good in an absolute moral sense. He's pretty explicit about that. So the problem is that Harris argues from a relative good to an absolutist good. He needs the second step in order to make statements about morality at all. Otherwise, he would only be talking about flourishing, because he wants to argue not only that most people prefer to flourish, that would be rather uncontroversial, but rather that making most people flourish is morally desirable. So this second step that is outlined here very nicely by Matthijssen is the step from flourishing to morality. So I think this second step is not only unnecessary, but also problematic. And this is explained very nicely in an ancient Chinese story, which is until today a very common saying in China. 画是天助, which in English means something like drawing a snake and adding feet. So the story is about three people who are given a bottle of wine, and then they think it's not really enough for each of us. We should make a competition, and then the winner of the competition will get the wine. And the competition is, let's draw a snake, and whoever finishes first gets the wine. So they set out to draw the snakes, and then one person is far ahead of the others, and then he says, I'm so far ahead of the others, I can even add the feet to the snake. And then the competition is over, and then the others say, wow, but that's not actually a snake. So by adding the feet to the snake, he basically ruined his success. So I think Sam Harris is adding, so to speak, the feet of morality to the snake of well-being. And that's not necessary. I think once we get rid of these moral feet, so to speak, we can pursue well-being, for instance, in the science of medicine, or even in philosophy, in a more direct way. And I think we can also, and this is important, introduce more ease in interpersonal relationships. I think highly moralized approaches, right, with a lot of feet, so to speak, added to the snake, can become very problematic, both in society as well as for individuals. It can make people more rigid, more pathological in many ways. In Daoism and in Zen Buddhism, we find a movement that takes away these unnecessary, so to speak, moral feet. So let me conclude by asking again the question, what is morality? First of all, I want to answer the question negatively by saying what morality is not. First, I think morality is, unlike, for instance, many ancient Greek philosophers thought, is not the quality of a person. And just to give a brief example, often the morality of a person is associated with their, let's say, sexual behavior. So one of the core examples of someone who is considered evil, even in today's society, would be a pedophile, right? But again, I think it makes much more sense to look at pedophilia, for instance, psychologically, and regard it as, for instance, some form of sexual disorder that can somehow be approached with therapeutically. And I think this makes much more sense than condemning pedophiles as immoral people. Secondly, I also think morality is not the quality of an action, or in other words, that we can deal with, let's say, for instance, bad actions more efficiently in a different way than treating them morally. And one way that society has developed, a major way, is through law. Again, let's say something like, to use a current example, a vaccination, right? People who do not get vaccinated, who refuse to get vaccinated, they can either be seen as immoral, and this would easily lead to very strong social divisions, and we see this happening, or we can just approach the act of not being vaccinated through certain regulations, where, for instance, society says if you're not vaccinated, then you can't go to like a mass event. So again, I think treating actions that for one reason or another we consider bad in a legal framework is much more efficient than treating them in a moral framework. Now, finally, I also do not think that morality is a quality of certain principles. And I addressed this earlier by saying that there is simply no such thing as a moral science that can establish moral laws in the same way that we, for instance, establish laws in physics. So if morality is neither the quality of a person, nor the quality of an action, nor the quality of a principle, then what is it? I think it's a way of communication that is very often used to legitimize certain actions. So this brings us finally back to a statement by Zizek, who said, if God exists, then everything is permitted. Now, this statement is a complete reversal of a statement that is not exactly, but somewhat similarly found in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. So the idea is that, well, if God doesn't exist, if we don't have religion, or for that matter, morality grounded in religion, then people have no guidelines and they can do whatever. But I think Zizek rightly reverses this statement by pointing out that it is precisely certain religious beliefs and moral beliefs attached to these religious beliefs that can convince people to do things that they otherwise wouldn't do, including violent things like waging war or killing other people, which once it is done in the name of religion or in the name of a morality attached to religion may feel legitimate. So Zizek says, I'm quoting here, most people today are spontaneously moral. The idea of torturing or killing another human being is deeply traumatic for them. So in order to make them do it, a larger sacred cause is needed, something that makes petty individual concerns about killing seem trivial. Religion or ethnic belonging fit this role perfectly. So again, in this statement, Zizek says, through religious beliefs, we can be convinced to do violent acts that otherwise we wouldn't do. I'd like, however, to correct Zizek's statement here. I think Zizek's analysis is not precise. He says that most people are spontaneously moral. I would say again the opposite. Most people are spontaneously amoral. They're not spontaneously inclined, for instance, to torture or kill someone else. And it is precisely moral language, often tied to, but sometimes also not tied to, religious language, that is used to overcome the hesitation, for instance, to kill others. And it is precisely by turning people from amoral agents into moral agents that they can be convinced, for instance, to do violent acts. So Zizek says that religion can transform moral people into immoral people. What I like to suggest, for instance, based on Daoist philosophy, is that moral discourse can transform amoral people into people that may or may not act violently. If you like to find out more about the Daoist approach to amorality, I suggest to watch another video that we did on a story from the Daoist text Zhuangzi that illustrates this in the form of a somewhat funny story.